Hey, it's Nikki, and today's episode is a special series called In the Loop, Communicating for Maximum Leadership Impact with my friends from Borshoff. I am a huge fan of the work Borshoff does to advance internal communication, and so happy that they have joined Gut Plus Science for a special series. Get ready for internal communication inspiration. There's so many nuggets of wisdom here.
Hey, it's Katherine Coble, your host for a very special Gut Plus Science series called In the Loop, Communicating for Maximum Leadership Impact. Our big goal is to help leaders become better communicators, because communication is your best tool for leading well. Let's go ahead and dive into this month's topic. Well, today I'm joined by a very special guest, Jenni Field, a communications expert and a founder of her own agency called Redefining Communications. Jenni has worked with dozens of leaders and organizations big and small. They've been all over the globe. And she's also a two-time author. Her first book is called Influential Internal Communication, and her second book is just out, and it's called Nobody Believes You. Become a Leader People Will Follow. Absolutely love that title, and I can't wait to get into it. Now, before we jump into the conversation, I want to encourage you to listen all the way through, because I'm going to be telling you at the end of the podcast about how you can enter to get your very own copy of Jenni's book. I'll be giving it away, several copies in fact, and I want to put all of these in your hands. That's how valuable I think Jenni's advice is to all leaders at all levels. Now let's get into it. Welcome, Jenni.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me today.
We're so excited you're with us. Now, Jenni, you are a pro after my own heart. For decades, I have been singing from the same song sheet as you, urging leaders to recognize just how critical their communications are to their leadership. So we have lots to get into, and especially related to your latest book. That's where we'll focus most of our attention. And I just love the provocative title of the book. But before we get into all of that, tell us just a little bit about your journey as a communications pro and an advisor to leaders.
Sure. So I have worked in communications for around 20 years. I'm just going to stick with around 20 years for a very long time. And I've worked inside organizations. So up until about 8 years ago, I was working in organizations doing internal communications. I was global head of communications for a FTSE 250 company in the UK. I've worked in different sectors, from pharmaceutical to defense to hospitality to advertising. And in all of those roles, I've absolutely loved that challenge of trying to improve the communication and ultimately the employee experience in organizations. And it was then in 2017, I decided to go out on my own. It was a bit of a case of if not now, when, and I've been doing it ever since. So setting up what I call a collective consultancy, where we have freelancers that work with different clients, and we work with people, as you said, sort of all over the world, looking at how communication can help the organization go from chaos to calm. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do is help that organization be more efficient and more effective by improving communication and leadership credibility.
So with that leadership focus in particular, what are some of the biggest frustrations that you've had when working with leaders? What is it that they're just not getting that you think is really critical?
All of it. No, so I think the biggest frustration I have is that so much of the work from leaders comes with positive intent. Yet there are so many unintended consequences from some of the things that they're doing with the best of intentions. And I think that's probably my biggest frustration, is no one sort of pointing those out, whether you're a trusted advisor working inside an organization or it's just not being listened to. There's a bit of a disconnect there. And I think that's the piece for me that is most frustrating, because I feel like if we just do this a bit differently, or we just sort of change the way we've said that, the impact and outcome can be so different. And I think that's my frustration, is it's so easy to adjust that if you're willing to listen and make those changes. And I think that's a big part of it, is accepting that you're part of the problem, if you like, which is just really uncomfortable for anybody.
Yeah, and absolutely. And to that point, this new book that you've put together is very much directed to leaders. It's very much directed to helping them gain some self-awareness, I think, based on what I read from it, Tell us a little bit about the book and why you decided to write it.
So I decided to write it because, well, there were a couple of reasons. So the first reason was that I believe all of the challenges in organizations around communication lead to the leadership team. So no matter how many times we look at changing the channels that we use to communicate or we do big campaigns, if the leaders aren't communicating and behaving in a way that's aligned to their values and stepping into that space, it's not going to have the impact that people want. So that's a big part of it. The second part of it was because during the pandemic and sort of just before, there was a lot of talk about being authentic as a leader. So in 2019, there was a lot of talk about authenticity. And during the pandemic, there was so much talk about leaders needing to have more compassion and more empathy and more vulnerability and all these really big words. And that's what really got me thinking about what is it that we really want leaders to be? What is it that makes us follow someone? What's important to us? And that's where the book came from, really, was an exploration of that leadership credibility piece and then really bringing that to life in a practical way, which is what I felt was missing, in a sense of actually, these are the things you could do tomorrow to just nudge that a bit more so that people will follow you. Whereas everything else felt a bit just big, just lots of big words and big theories without so much of the practical stuff in there.
Yeah, so I know that whole trend of talking about empathy and vulnerability, it's almost like those words were everything for a period of time. And that's great. And of course everyone says, of course I need to be more empathetic as a leader. Of course I need to be more vulnerable, but what does that really mean? I feel like in the book you actually took that a step further. And you even talked about this idea of a crisis of credibility that you believe many leaders face. Talk to us a little bit about what that crisis of credibility actually means. That sounds kind of scary.
Yes. Yeah. There's a theme there with the words and phrases I've used, isn't there? But there is a bit of a crisis of credibility. And in fact, I was just writing about the challenge of the return to office mandate, which is everywhere at the moment, which is quite a good example of how we can see it manifesting itself, because leaders are trying to get people back to the office. They're trying to get people maybe moving away from hybrid and back more than sort of 3-4 days a week. And all of that comes back to wanting to create connection. They're all talking about we want to create connection and collaborate more and a sense of belonging and the culture. But the challenge is that they haven't done the work to be seen as credible so that people will follow them into that sort of change of direction. So we've got sort of two worlds coming together now. And that's the crisis of credibility, is we sort of take it for granted that I'm in a leadership position. There's a bit of that old school thinking of I'm in charge, people will just follow me. And it doesn't work like that in the world of work today. And what I need to see you as credible will be different to what you need to see someone as credible. So we have to understand that and the context of that. But if we don't think about all of those little interactions every day and all of those things that could be chipping away at trust, at our perceived capability, at all of those things, we're going to end up in this crisis of credibility where people are just not going to follow leaders and go off and do their own thing, or we'll have this sort of what we've got at the moment, which is a lot of disagreement and anger and frustration between two different parts of the organization on that specific return to office piece. That's the challenge, really, is the impact it has on the ability to be a successful, productive, efficient organization.
Yeah, so a big part of that crisis of credibility, you mentioned it, is different people have different perspectives on what they put value in when they look to a leader. There are some general things that we all agree on, but for the most part, you may put more emphasis on something than I do, etc. And so in your book, you actually talk about these 8 different practices of credibility. So can you walk us through what those 8 things are kind of at a high level? And then let's maybe dive into some of the more particular ones that people should really be paying attention to.
Yeah, sure. So I will try and go through them alphabetically. I can remember them in that way. So capability is one, and that's very important to people to see that you're capable in your leadership position. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to have the knowledge of the specialist subject. You might have industry knowledge. So knowing where you fit in that knowledge piece is quite important. We also have empathy, which we've touched on, and it's important to think about empathy as believing someone else's experience regardless of your own. Sometimes we talk about being in someone else's shoes. That's not quite right. We want to believe someone else regardless of our own experience. Then we have integrity, which is my favorite one because it's the one that we all think we have, but sometimes don't, because it's quite hard. Integrity is about doing what you say you're going to do and staying true to your word. And that can be tricky depending on where you are as a leader. Then we have likability, which is different to being liked. So there has to be an element of likability as a leader in the sense that people enjoy being around you, but it doesn't mean that everyone has to like you. And that distinction is really important to make. Otherwise, you're going to get tied up making decisions because you want people to like you. And that's really difficult as a leader. The next one is supportive, which is all about making sure that you're creating inclusive spaces. You're being very humble, so you're putting other people first. The supportive piece actually came out really high in the research that I did to come up with the 8 practices as being very important to individuals as well. So supportive is a big one. We have trustworthiness. So you can't really be credible if you're not trustworthy. And that includes all the normal things about being honest and transparent. And then we have 2 V's to finish off. We have visionary as a practice. This isn't about being a visionary leader. It's not about being the next Steve Jobs, but it's about having a vision and the ability to communicate where you're going so that you're inspiring people to follow you. And then the last one is vulnerability, which again, we've touched on already, but vulnerability is all about creating connection. That's the outcome you want from being vulnerable. And I always talk about it being the balance between being personal but not intimate, because it's another very big word that's talked about a lot without really getting into what that means. So those are all 8, a whistle-stop tour of the 8.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I do want to go back to the one that you mentioned as your favorite, integrity, because as I read your book, this one really struck me because I think so many leaders, when you say you have to have integrity as a leader, they're like, oh, well, of course. I mean, you have to have integrity. That makes total sense. And of course I have integrity. But this was actually a really big leadership lesson for me early in my leadership. The idea that, yes, you may be ethical in your approach to things, but integrity is actually more about things like you said, keeping your word, following through, being consistent, things like that. And not only can that be difficult, it could actually be something where things change, right? Things change in the leader's world, and the leader is sometimes having to react to shifting dynamics and shifting priorities. And so the thing I said we were going to focus on last week, I may have kind of changed my mind this week. So talk to me a little bit about that, and how can leaders overcome this actual really big issue that isn't always of our own making?
Yeah, and it also depends where you are in that leadership position, because often I'm talking to leaders who are in the C-suite, but you have leaders who are middle managers and sometimes they're not the decision makers. So that makes it really hard to have that integrity when you're in the middle. So when we're looking at integrity, you're right. It's not that ethical piece. It's that keeping your word, it's being accountable for the decisions and the things that you're saying. And it's being genuine about that as well. And it's the accountability piece that's really important. So integrity has to come from keeping a word. And I tell a lot of stories in the book with names changed of people that I've worked with over the years. And I'll always remember a story of working with a leader where he sort of promised his team again and again and again that they would get a percentage of the profits for selling more things and stuff like that. And it just kept being pushed and pushed and pushed. And in the end, I had to say to him, you just don't have any integrity. And he just looked absolutely shocked because he just wasn't seeing the connection between you're not keeping your word. The team now don't trust you because of that integrity gap, but you're also not being accountable for the fact that you are pushing that. Like, if you want to push that or you want to change your mind, that's fine, but you have to be accountable for that shift and communicate that in a way that is genuine and that people will understand. And I think that's what we sometimes miss. That's where we lose that integrity because we feel like we've done something wrong, or we might feel a bit of shame or whatever might be driving that. So we just hide a bit. Whereas if we communicate, it just opens that door and builds that integrity so much more than if we just hide.
Definitely. That's a great example. And I know throughout the book, you sprinkled quite a few other great examples. So tell me another one, maybe one of your favorites that was kind of an aha moment for a leader that you've worked with.
I think one of the the biggest aha moments that I had with a team was trying to figure out the root cause of the problem. And sometimes we think it's one thing and it's something else. So I was working with a team and they thought they had a psychological safety problem, which is much more cultural. So we've got a sort of big cultural challenge here. But actually, through the conversations that we had, we could see that it wasn't that. It was much more focused on the leadership and much more focused on credibility and trustworthiness and integrity. And that really came from those unintended consequences that we sort of touched on already, where they were trying to do the right thing by having meetings that were sort of confidential spaces where leaders could talk. But because they were so confidential, nothing was shared. So nobody knew what was being discussed. Nobody knew what the outcomes were. It just felt like this really closed little club that nobody could see what was going on. And I can see how they got there. And it was really clear how that decision was made. But the outcome of that and the impact was having the complete opposite effects on the wider organization. And I think for me, seeing those aha moments with clients, when you start to dig a bit deeper into what's going on, is just the best part of the work, because you can then really fix that. But you've got to go a bit deeper into, we think it might be this problem. Well, let's talk about what are the symptoms that you're seeing. Let's talk about what's going on. And then let's really dive in and try and fix that, because otherwise you're just going to focus on the wrong thing. If I'd believed them that it was psychological safety without digging into that, we would never have picked up this leadership issue that was sort of over on the left-hand side that was having quite a big impact on the trustworthiness and credibility of the team.
Yeah. So self-awareness is a big one and can be quite difficult, I think, for leaders. We're just reacting a lot of times. We're trying to read the room, but we're not necessarily reading ourselves. Talk a little bit more about some of those symptoms and maybe some of the things that you've discovered with leaders along the way that have helped them really make this real and really grab onto some of these ideas that you're sharing.
Yeah, you're right. It is the self-awareness piece, which is a bit uncomfortable, and it takes quite a lot of work to do that, and to feel safe in that space to say, look, I think I need some help to build my credibility. That's not always an easy thing to sort of put your hand up for. But if you're seeing certain symptoms in your organization, like people are off on sick leave, you have retention challenges, you have sort of forced fun going on in the organization where it feels a bit like we're forcing everybody to come together. You might have productivity issues, however you're defining productivity. And I always put that caveat in there. But there will be some organizational metrics that will be going on that you'll be thinking, this isn't quite right, or this isn't how we should be operating, or we're not quite achieving the goals we should be achieving. If that's happening, then we have to look at all the different things that could be contributing to that. And whilst there could be elements of policy, communication, ways of working in there, we also have to look at ourselves and how we might be contributing to that and what we might be able to do differently. And I think that's the biggest thing I always want leaders to take away is everybody can build credibility. It's not something that you're necessarily born with. We can all build that, and we can do things just with a bit of focused time in the right areas. We can make quite a big difference. And I think that's important to remember, just not that you've got to do loads of deep work and it's really out of reach. Actually, a few small things could make quite a big impact to that retention number that you're trying to chase, or the employee engagement scores you're trying to get up. Whatever that metric is, there has to be an element of looking at the leadership team in that.
Love that. So let's talk a little bit about the two V's that you mentioned. First, I want to look at the idea of vulnerability a little bit more, because this is one that makes a lot of leaders very uncomfortable. When you tell a leader, oh, you have to be more vulnerable. And I loved what you said earlier, that this isn't so much about making it intimate, it's just making it more personal. I think I got that right. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, and people go to intimate, right? When you talk about being vulnerable, we immediately go to, do I need to cry in front of people? Like, do I need to share some really personal story? We immediately go over there. And I've been guilty of that. I've been in situations where I've had this moment of, oh God, do I need to go over into that space? And you don't. So it is balancing the personal with the intimate. When we talk about being vulnerable, there's always an outcome. So for all of the 8 practices in the book, I talk about the outcome that happens if it's missing, or kind of what you're aiming for. So when you're looking at vulnerability, if you're lacking in that, you're getting disconnection from your team. So the outcome we want is connection. So I can't be vulnerable just for the sake of being vulnerable, because it's not going to have the impact and the outcome that I want, which is to connect to the people that I'm leading. And that's the important thing, because if we just go down the route of, I'm going to be vulnerable and I'm going to share more about myself or my mental health or my personal life or whatever it is, there has to be a reason for that that links us back to creating connection. And sometimes we can get that wrong. Sometimes we can share things that we think will create connection, but actually disconnect. So we have to know the people that we're wanting to follow us in order to get that right. One of the sort of quickest examples I give people, or the quickest advice around vulnerability, is using your out of office on your email to say what you're doing. So if you're at a conference, if you're on holiday with your family, if you're having a long weekend, whatever it might be, then share what it is that you're doing. You can just write, I'm having a few days away with my family. I always share what I'm doing, whether it's a good reason for being off or a not so good reason for being off. I will always use my out of office to share that, because it brings that ability to connect on a more personal human level. And that's what I'm trying to do.
You know what I love about that too is I recall that, for example, if you use Microsoft Outlook, and maybe this is available in others too, but when I do my out of office, I can have a version for internal audiences and I can have a version for external. So maybe I don't want to necessarily be vulnerable with the outside world, but I can tailor my message to that internal world. And you can actually do the same thing in the chat function of many, Slack and Teams and things like that as well. And I think that's actually a great, very simple way to just get started, maybe if you're not sure about this vulnerability idea.
Yeah, exactly that. It doesn't have to be some big story and some big life-changing moment. Being able to say, I'm taking a long weekend to spend with my family. It doesn't matter. It's giving people that little bit of insight to you that will create a connection. And it's that outcome piece that's important.
I love that. Okay, so let's look at the other V, visionary. This is one I think that also scares many leaders who don't necessarily see themselves as, like you said, a Steve Jobs or somebody who's just got some amazing, big picture vision that can rally the troops toward the next big innovation. Talk to me a little bit about what you mean when you say a leader has to be visionary.
So this is about having a visionary practice. So I talk about the 8 as the practices of credibility. And I have to put that distinction in, because I don't want people to think I've got to be this huge visionary, game-changing leader that's going to change the world. You might be that person and that's great, but we can't all be that person because the world would be exhausting. So this is about making sure that you're inspiring, that you are passionate and that people can see that, and that you've got the communication skills to communicate well. And that's what we're looking at. So we're looking at our ability to communicate well, to inspire people with our passion so that they will follow us. And ultimately, as a leader, you want people to follow you. So you're going in a direction, wherever that might be. I'm following you somewhere. Where are we going? And that might be that in the next 90 days, this is the thing that we need to deliver. It doesn't need to be something huge, but I need to be able to communicate the importance of that, why it's important, and inspire you to do the work that's needed to deliver that. If we don't have that visionary practice, we just get apathy. So if people aren't moving and they aren't doing what you need them to do, or you're seeing results in your surveys where it's sort of middle of the road answers, that's a bit of a sign that we've got a bit of apathy going on and people don't really know why they're doing what they're doing or where they're going or why they should be there. And it's often one that I always start with. So people often say, which is the one that you think people should focus on? And it's the visionary, because that's your anchor point. That's how people know where they're going. And if you don't know where you're going because you're in that middle management section and there's a bit of uncertainty at the top and you're listening to this and thinking, but I don't know because I don't have clarity above me, then what can you kind of hold on to? What can you focus in on those 90 days or the next month, and make it shorter and make it something that you can celebrate and you can see that achievement and that success so you can get that momentum. That's important as well. So it doesn't need to be something huge, but it has to be somewhere where you're taking people and where you need them to go. Product finishing, service delivery, could be anything.
Right. It could just be something related to a specific client or a specific customer even, or just something like you said, the next 90 days. It doesn't necessarily have to be we're solving the world's problems and this is how we're going to get there in the next 5 years. It can be, what are we working toward for tomorrow?
Yeah. And 90 days is a really good timeline. It's one that we often come back to because it's sort of long enough to see an impact, but short enough that if you need to move, you can still move direction. But you have to also celebrate in that. And I think that's important, making sure that as you're moving towards those goals, if you're ticking things off, making sure that there's a moment of reflection and celebration with the team as well.
Right. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, Jenni. Thank you so much for showing us how leadership can be so practical and how we can practically build this skill set that perhaps we didn't learn in school or we didn't get on the job training for. We're literally learning it as we go. I think it's just so helpful no matter what level leader you are. The book is called Nobody Believes You, Become a Leader People Will Follow. And if you want a copy of this, I'll be collecting names and doing a drawing for several of these. Just be sure that you follow me on LinkedIn and share this episode or my post about it with the hashtag in the loop and tell me that you're interested in a copy of the book. I'll be drawing winners at the end of the month that this podcast airs in and getting those out to the people who win them. So, Jenni, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great fun.
We just left the world a little bit better. Now, go do something with it.